Big time banger at bantamweight. We have Canada's Ayman Zahabi taking on Draco, the Great Drakolini Rodriguez. Matt, we previewed this fight in great detail not that long ago, really going in depth as to Draco Rodriguez's beginnings and his entrance into the UFC. And for Canada's Ayman Zahabi, well, unfortunately, he was the reason that this fight fell apart in the first place. It was a COVID test the week of the fight on his way down to the States. So finally we get this fight. We're going to head back into the past for the prediction of the future. Really looking forward to our next fight at bantamweight. And we have a UFC debut for Draco, the Great Drakolini, or Drakolini Rodriguez, taking on Ayman Zahabi. Matt, for Ayman Zahabi, it has been a minute since we've seen him in the UFC, and I had to go back and watch all of the UFC tape on him because, hey, it's been, 4 years, almost 5 years since he was on the regional scene, and for Ayman Zahabi on the Canadian regional scene, went 6-0, all 6 wins by first-round finish, 3 of them by knockout, 3 of them by submission. At a time, he was a brown belt in jiu-jitsu. He's since upgraded. He's a black belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And in the 3 UFC fights, just so happened, Matt, that we were there for his UFC debut in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. Brian Stan, Todd Grisham on the call for that one. And in that fight, Ayman Zahabi, it was a really good fight. It was against Vieira. And with Reginaldo Vieira, he won the Ultimate Fighter Brazil Season 4. I know he got knocked out in the quarterfinals, came back, won. And he had this fight against Zahabi where they really marketed the Canadian, the fact that his brother's, of course, Faraz from TriStar. He's a really technical fighter. And if you go back and watch that fight, when Zahabi had his most success, it was crashing forward. It was always setting things up with his left leg when he's from the orthodox stance. He'll switch to southpaw, but the weird thing is, he doesn't throw a lot when he goes southpaw. It's almost to just close distance and offer a different look, but it's not like he really pumps the jab out there. It does a whole lot with it. It's just to throw something different. So in that fight against Vieira, he wins it. I had scored at 29-27 for Zahabi. Then you look at his next fight, UFC 217 on the prelims, taking on Ricardo Ramos. And Matt, you think about that fight, you think about the finish, but before that, Zahabi was having a lot of success in that fight.
It is always odd when you look at a fighter and you try to think, okay, where did they fight their best fight? Well, for Ayman Zahabi, he fought his best fight in a loss. And not just a loss, it was one of the more vicious knockout losses you'll ever see. Because he gets, double spinning elbowed, not something you see all that often in the UFC. It was very strange, though, when Ayman Zahabi fights like he's playing Dance Dance Revolution. His feet never stop moving. He is always doing something with his feet, whether that is switching stances. He does do a lot of in and out movement. Not exactly like a Dominic Cruz, but he does try to send you a lot of feints, and he doesn't always throw punches to do so. In the Ramos fight, he did well on the feet. He was in really good clinch work. And the real key for Ayman Zahabi is when he lets his combinations go, he does have really good success, because we saw it kind of similar to a Gavin Tucker last weekend, where when he was throwing in combination, he was having a lot of success. Maybe the first 2 would land on the arms, but then that would open up the third strike. And with Ayman, he has a very similar game plan where he is going to dart in, throw his combination, try to get out of distance. He can get caught, though, and we have seen that before. Sometimes he will try to extend the combination if he thinks he is landing well, and he is susceptible to the counter on that, and that worries me a little bit against a guy like Draco Rodriguez, who does have big power at this weight class. And for Zahabi as well, just last point, he is good at wrestling, but I wish he did more of it. Again, we talk about his jiu-jitsu credentials. It's not like he's a fighter who goes out there and really tries to get the fight to the mat constantly. If it does end up there, he is more than happy to oblige, but it's very odd that a guy who does have such a good grappling acumen doesn't actively use it in more MMA fights.
I think Draco Rodriguez is going to bring it to him in that way, and that's why I think this fight is a lot more competitive than the odds. And then at the same time, you look at Zahabi, he's been off for, almost a year and a half, and that's the thing. You look at his, his pro career so far. 1 fight in 2012, 2 in 2014, 2 in 2015. Then he fights once in 2016, twice in 2017, then 2019, then 2020. It's been a lot of inactivity. And I went back and read an article and a bit of an interview that he did with Alves up here in Canada, which is the French language arm of TSN, which is our Canadian version of ESPN, to make that complicated for anybody that's not a Canadian or French language speaker. But the crux of the interview that he did was the fact that A, it sucks that I've been off for so long. B, I'm on the call sheet and I keep accepting fights, but guys turn me away. And he's not really in a position to take fights because he's lost 2 in a row. And the other thing about Ayman Zahabi is that, and they've said this on broadcast before, he's the type of guy, and we talked about this with Adrian Yanez, so same division, last week on This Week in MMA. Hey, do you watch a lot of tape on your opponents, or do you trust the coaches? And he's like, well, I was on the regional scene, so there wasn't a lot of tape, but now I'm going to watch more of it, and I really incorporate it into the game plan with my coaches. For Zahabi, he's one of those guys that goes out and does a ton of film study, and it's almost like he over-prepares for fights, and I think that's a trouble of, well, my brother's Faraz, and I stay at the gym, and he talked about this in the interview too. Well, I make money during the day because I'm associated with the gym, so fighting's just kind of like out there. I wish I could fight more, but at the end of the day, I've got the gym. For Draco Rodriguez coming in here, this was a guy that got passed over, and I remember this story. At UFC 239, he was supposed to come in on short notice and take on Chito Vera, and King of the Cage wouldn't release him from his contract.
Unfortunate.
It was after he had fought Tony Gravely for the belt and had lost. It was after he got a win there. I want to say that was January 2019. And then he was looking forward to taking the fight against Chito on short notice. He was originally booked for a King of the Cage main event against Johnny Munoz Jr., who ended up in the UFC as well. That fight fell through. Then he had one more fight with King of the Cage. At the time, the promoter and co-owner said, well, he's got 4 fights left in his contract. I know what the promoter was actually trying to do, and it's kind of weird, and you might not agree with me here, but Draco Rodriguez is young. I mean, the guy's only, 24 years old? The promoter wanted him to kind of grow in the promotion where he didn't have to take a fight way too soon. And I get it, but at the same time, if you're Draco Rodriguez, you're going to petition hard for that UFC debut. Unfortunately, he had to wait. He ended up taking a fight on Dana White's Contender Series this summer against Mana Martinez. Got a first-round triangle choke. It was a wild fight. It was a fight that was pick'em odds. But I went back and watched a ton of Draco Rodriguez tape for this one. This guy's wild as f***. Like, you look at 6 of his 7 wins are by finish. He has a 13-0 amateur record, which is insane. That's too much of an amateur career, if you ask me. That started when he was 19. And the fact that he has all these armbar, triangle choke, guillotine, what else? His first pro fight, another guillotine. He was a white belt in 2018. It's crazy how aggressive he fights. Now, the level of competition is a bit of an issue. Again, Mana Martinez getting that win was a big deal. So credit where credit's due. And that has to happen. When you're a guy in the regional scene, you're beating the guys you should beat. Then you go up on the big scene. You get a win like that on Contender Series. You get a contract. He deserved it. Kudos to him. UFC fans and prospect fans have had their eyes on Draco Rodriguez for a while. I got to talk about that Tony Gravely fight, though. Gravely! King of the Cage, territorial conflict back in 2018. He gets beat pillar to post by Tony Gravely. And listen, Tony Gravely's a good fighter. That was his last fight with King of the Cage. Then he went and dominated CES. Then he ended up in the UFC. But when he had that fight, his takedown defense wasn't great. He was fishing for submissions, but he got beaten on the ground all 5 rounds until he got finished at the end of the 5th. I worry about that a little bit, and he's still a little green, but overall, this guy's such a good prospect. His hands are great, his aggressiveness is awesome, and he doesn't give a damn about what belt color you have in jiu-jitsu. He is going to go full bore, balls to the wall, and that should make for a really interesting fight here against Zahabi.
Okay, I don't know if we can take a lot from the Gravely loss, because just Gravely doesn't fight at all like Ayman Zahabi. Gravely is a much more dominant wrestler than Ayman Zahabi, and again, I would love it if Ayman Zahabi fought like Tony Gravely. He probably had a ton of success because he is so good on the ground, but he's one of these guys who, I don't want to say he's fallen in love with his hands, but he is much more happy to get into a striking exchange than he is in the grappling, and it is a very curious case when you do have a guy who, belt-wise, he might not be as good as Ayman Zahabi, but in MMA, his grappling, I would say, at least rivals it, if not better, because he uses it a lot more. So I am very excited for if this fight does hit the mat. I'm really curious to see who has the advantage. The inactivity of Ayman Zahabi does really worry me. I would like to see him compete quite a bit more. He's a young guy who is improving, so it would be nice if he could get in there a little bit more often. I know he is, and you had mentioned it, he is kind of in that James Krause level where it's like, okay, I'm making money being a coach at a gym. Fighting's not the most important thing to me, but I still do like doing it. For Zahabi, it's just one of those things. If he was more active, I do think we would see more progression between every fight for him. And this fight is really hard to pick. I know you've got the odds up. They are quite close.
Oh,
guess
they're not
really,
close.
sorry.
They're stupid. So Draco Rodriguez opened a -185 favorite. That line dropped just about early last week. He was a -230 at one point. It's coming back up. So right now he's -193. If we have a look at Ayman Zahabi, he opened a +160, went up as high as a +186. He's now at a +160 again. That line's moved all day towards Ayman Zahabi. If we look at the Tapology votes, they're just silly. 640 total votes, 81% going Rodriguez, 70% by decision. I think if Rodriguez can stay busy enough on the feet, can push a pace, and can stay on his bike for 3 rounds, he can get a win over Ayman Zahabi. If I didn't make a pick on this one, I'd feel pretty good because this is honestly one of the toughest fights to pick. Again, I went back and watched so many Draco Rodriguez fights against scrubs in the regional scene that I didn't really gain a whole lot out of it, other than the fact that this guy's a great prospect, and I'm really looking forward to him fighting in the UFC. If he beats Ayman Zahabi, that's a huge feather in his cap. I've seen Ayman Zahabi have success like that. He was one of those guys that was the next great Canadian prospects when he made his debut. And then even after getting the win over Vieira. So for me, if Ayman Zahabi can, again, do what he did in the Hamosh fight, if he can at least throw that nice kick, push a bit of a pace, rush forward, try not to get caught, and as long as you don't get hit by some spinning stuff, he can rely on his grappling. Because I think if Draco Rodriguez takes down Ayman Zahabi, it's going to be weird. He hasn't faced a guy like Zahabi on the ground like that. I mean, yeah, Tony Gravely's a wrestler, so it's a different story. I'm slightly edging Rodriguez in this fight, but again, I would not be surprised if Ayman Zahabi won it whatsoever.
So I do agree, and for a lot of the variables that you have brought up, the movement of Zahabi is going to be really important in this fight, and as the fight progresses, he does tend to get more stationary. We saw that in the Hamos fight. He'll do really well, and he is good at staying active early on in the fight, but he will kind of settle in as the fight progresses, and that does worry me against a guy like Draco Rodriguez, because if Zahabi could stay on his bike thoroughly throughout the 15 minutes, it would be really hard for Draco Rodriguez to find him. But the fact that Zahabi will get a little stationary and plant his feet, I like the activity of Rodriguez. And like you had said, when the fight hits the mat, I'm not going to really predict anything because who knows how it's going to go. But I do like Draco Rodriguez in this fight.
If this gets past a first round, then maybe and this is going to kind of contradict what you said. I might slightly edge one guy over the other. So I'd like to see it pass one round. Because with Zahabi, again, he can typically stay on his bike all right. In the fight that he had against Vieira tired. And he just started shooting just kind of like desperation takedowns by the third round. That's why Zahabi's takedown defense is so high. It's because of that one fight. Because Vieira went 2 for 13. In his second fight against Hamosh, he kind of stayed on his bike. And again, second round was good. First round was all right. Third round, he was gaining until Hamosh did one spinning elbow. And Joe Rogan... It's been a long time since he's had some good commentary, but in that one he goes, Hamosh is looking for the spinning back elbow. He's kind of loading up with his weight, and then he really landed it to the point where he knocked him out cold. And then, we didn't even talk about it, but the fight against Vince Murdoch just pressured him, switched stances, threw low kicks, really threw the kitchen sink at him, and just frustrated him overall. And you can tell Zahabi's a cerebral guy. In that interview with Alves, they talked about the fact that he's been reading a lot of psychology books, trying to be mind over matter, trying to really press a pace within himself to put on a good fight. So I'll be interested to see which Zahabi we get in this one. Now, as an update, as far as those odds are concerned, Draco Rodriguez opened a -204 average on best fight odds, kind of trending around a -190. If we look over at Canada's Zahabi, open a +167 now at a +157 or thereabouts. And if we have a look at the total Tapology votes, 749 of them, 82% going Rodriguez, 66% by decision. All I really have on this is what I had before, is the fact that Draco Rodriguez is incredibly wild. He takes tons and tons of risks. It usually ends up in a finish. If he's able to kind of bring his technique together, I think he could be a really interesting prospect in this division. And for Ayman Zahabi, hasn't won a fight in almost 4 years. It's 3 years and 11 months ago. We were there. That was the first UFC show we ever went to. Just kind of crazy to think that even in that fight that Zahabi had against Reginaldo Vieira, really close fight. The Hamosh fight, he had some success in that one before he got knocked out by a spinning back fist and then another spinning back fist. And then his last time out against Vince Morales, that one's tough, especially being in Canada for that fight. So overall take here, you still keeping the pick that you had before.
So I know I had Zahabi before. I like his movement, especially.
You had Rodriguez.
Oh, sorry. Well, okay, good, because I was going to say I am going to stick with Draco Rodriguez or switch my pick to Rodriguez. Again, you had mentioned he take a lot of unnecessary risks, but against a guy like Ayman Zahabi, he's a good striker. He's not a powerful striker by any means. So even if you do leave yourself open with some of those big overhands and big hooks, Ayman might be able to catch you, but I don't think he can catch you hard enough to really make you pay for it. Should be an interesting fight. I wouldn't be surprised if Zahabi is able to get the win, but I'm going to go with Rodriguez in this one.
Matt, both of us going with Draco Rodriguez, but definitely one that I would keep off of my card because as far as those odds are concerned, Rodriguez at about a 2-1 favorite, not for me. So we'll see what happens in this one. A possible fight of the night on our cards. We're really looking forward to it. And we have a great card coming up. I mean, Ketlin Vieira taking on Yana Kunitskaya in the co-main event. And your main event, Curtis Blaydes and Derek Lewis. So keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, as we always say.
Let's get into it.